World War II was the American Empire's greatest victory. American culture deems this a great war fought by our greatest generation. This began with the publication of General Dwight Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe, followed by a dozen popular Hollywood movies in which enthusiastic Americans destroyed evil Nazis with few losses. This documentary is not about the politics or strategy of the war, but the fact that liberating France was a bloody mess and millions of American soldiers suffered. American author Paul Fussel served as an infantry platoon leader in France from 1944 until he was wounded in 1945. He once wrote, "For the past 50 years, the Allied war has been sanitized and romanticized almost beyond recognition by the sentimental, the loony patriotic, the ignorant, and the bloodthirsty. I have tried to balance the scales. I read accounts of so-called battles that I had been in, and they had no relation whatever to what had happened." Most Americans opposed entry into World War II after suffering from pointless World War I. Of the 12 million Americans who served during World War II, only 1 million volunteered. The rest were drafted and served because of the threat of imprisonment. Over 6,000 American men were imprisoned for years after refusing to serve. Americans are told that a huge Allied army landed at French beaches in 1944 and surged eastward, routing the Nazis. Americans have visions of American tanks dashing across Europe, with cheering civilians waving them forward. The truth is different. The amphibious landing at Normandy went well, but the Germans quickly contained the landing area, resulting in weeks of bloody fighting. Liberating France was not a wonderful adventure for American soldiers nor French civilians. The Allies employed mass firepower in the form of artillery and airstrikes to dislodge the Germans. This destroyed many French towns and cities. The Allies finally broke out as the outnumbered Germans escaped to Belgium, where they dug in and fought on. Treating and evacuating American casualties was a huge effort that utilized 40 hospital trains and several hospital ships. Some American divisions had casualty rates of over 100%. An American infantry division had around 14,000 soldiers. After landing on D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 4th Infantry Division suffered 22,660 casualties in 299 days of combat. The 90th Infantry Division landed 3 days later and suffered 19,200 casualties in 308 days of combat. These figures confuse people who cannot grasp that it was rare for an infantryman who landed on D-Day to remain fit for duty by the end of the year. Most of the replacements were killed or wounded too. The U.S. Army had as many psychiatric casualties in Europe as it did physically wounded soldiers. In Paul Fussel's book, Wartime, he wrote, "In war, it is not just the weak soldiers, or the sensitive ones, or the highly imaginative or cowardly ones who will break down. Inevitably, all will break down if in combat long enough. There is no such thing as getting used to combat. Each moment of combat imposes a strain so great that men will break down in direct relation to the intensity and duration of their experience." The U.S. Army suffered 6,600 casualties on D-Day, but later suffered 64,000 casualties from cold injury, not wounds, but pneumonia and frostbite. It had few stocks of decent mittens and gloves, fur-lined parkas, thermal underwear, or insulated winter boots. The European winter of 1944-45 was the coldest in years. The Germans had fought in Russia and knew that when a winter storm arrived and pushed temperatures well below freezing, soldiers could not remain outdoors for days. Units must withdraw to towns and farmhouses, so soldiers can survive indoors. American officers kept their troops in the field, and soldiers suffered. In The Boys' Crusade, Fussel explained other losses of manpower. He said most fighting was done by American infantrymen who were just out of high school. They were drafted and didn't want to be in the war or the army. Self-inflicted wounds, a downward bullet wound to a leg or arm, were so common that the Army kept a tally and used it to measure unit morale. The Army's final tally was 19,000 deserters in Europe. Desertion became so bad that U.S. Army generals took drastic action. In January 1945, they selected one deserter to teach soldiers a lesson. Draftee Private Eddie Slovic was executed by a firing squad, and his fate reported to all units. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans sent 150 English-speaking commandos dressed in U.S. Army uniforms to infiltrate American front lines and cause chaos. They were quickly captured because American MPs guarded all roadways. Any healthy American soldier heading toward the rear was presumed a deserter and arrested. The U.S. Army deemed these 150 Germans war criminals. They were tied to posts and shot by firing squads. Lots of Americans surrendered too. In late 1944, the U.S. Army's new 106th Infantry Division was attacked by a large German force at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. Its soldiers were so startled by the unexpected appearance of large numbers of attacking Germans with tanks that officers jumped into jeeps and fled, while 8,000 GIs quickly surrendered. All these losses caused the U.S. Army to take dramatic action. Black soldiers were segregated and limited to support units because of prejudice that they could not fight as infantry. By 1945, replacements were badly needed, so General Eisenhower quietly allowed blacks to join white infantry units, where they were afforded an equal opportunity to be slaughtered. American troops fought hard to help win the war, although the Russians did most of the fighting to defeat the Nazis. The Germans were far more experienced and even better equipped. By a force of numbers and air power support, American infantrymen slogged forth until the war was won. They were victorious, but just wanted to go home and forget the horrible experience.